Most married men believe that meeting every requirement builds appreciation. They're wrong. There's a point where increased provision doesn't just fail to generate gratitude, it actively confirms that none was ever coming. And by the time most husbands notice the dynamic has solidified, the internal decision was already made years ago. This isn't about men providing too much or too little. It's about a fundamental misreading of what their wives are actually registering. Men track what they give. Women track something else entirely. Here's what I've observed. A husband provides income, stability, resources. He's consistent. He's reliable. He does what marriage supposedly requires. From his perspective, he's fulfilling his end. From her perspective, something different is being registered. And it's not gratitude. It's entitlement to a baseline she now considers standard. Men assume provision operates on a reciprocal model. Meet her needs, receive acknowledgement. But that's not how the assessment actually works. What's being measured isn't what he provides. It's whether providing it gives him any negotiating position. When a husband increases what he gives, more income, more help, more flexibility with her preferences, he thinks he's building goodwill. What often happens instead is that the increase itself becomes the new baseline. And once that baseline shifts, it doesn't shift back. It just recalibrates upward. I'll explain why in a moment, but first, notice what doesn't change in her behavior during this time. Not dramatic rejection, not obvious coldness. What doesn't change is responsiveness. Physical availability remains minimal. Appreciation remains unexpressed. The dynamic doesn't improve. It just continues at whatever reduced level it had already settled into. Men interpret this as, she's tired, she's stressed, she needs more support, so they increase provision, more financial flexibility, more household help, more accommodation of her preferences, and this is usually the point where what was already minimal becomes functionally non-existent. Because here's the misreading: men think they're solving a problem. Women have already made an internal decision about what the marriage is, and that decision isn't based on provision. It's based on whether his provision gives him any authority or whether it's simply expected. If a husband has to negotiate for basic physical intimacy, she's already categorized the marriage, not consciously, not as a deliberate strategy, but the classification happens, and once it does, increased provision doesn't reclassify his position upward. It just makes the existing hierarchy more obvious. This is where men usually assume they need different tactics. They don't. They need to recognize that the framework itself is inverted. Marriage isn't supposed to be a one-way provisioning system. But when it becomes one, improving performance doesn't restore reciprocity. It just makes the imbalance more efficient. Men often say, but things were different before marriage. Yes, that's usually true. Pre-marriage interest isn't the same as post-marriage obligation. Pre-marriage interest included maintaining his interest. Post-marriage obligation assumes his interest is locked in and no longer requires maintenance. And this is the part men resist. There's no amount of provision that restores what existed before the contract was signed. If it's not present after marriage, increasing investment doesn't create it. It just makes the absence more expensive. Here's what I see happen next. The husband doesn't reduce provision. He increases it further. More income directed toward her preferences. More autonomy granted. More schedule flexibility. He's trying to close the gap between what he gives and what he receives. But the gap isn't a space that provision can cross. It's a conclusion she's already reached about what the marriage structure is. Wives don't usually announce this. They're often not even fully conscious of it. What they feel is, this is what marriage is. He works, I exist. That's the arrangement. Not because they're calculating, because the dynamic has settled into a form where his effort is invisible and her presence is treated as sufficient contribution. Men think, if I just demonstrate how much I'm doing, she'll recognize it. But she's already seeing it. The problem isn't that she's missing information, it's that the information isn't producing the response he expects. His effort is categorized as duty, not gift. And duties don't generate gratitude. This is the point where timelines matter. Men remember when physical intimacy was more frequent. They think, 2 years ago, we were intimate weekly. What changed? But what they're measuring is behavior. What changed wasn't her capacity. It was her assessment of whether maintaining that frequency served any purpose for her. Women are slow to verbalize this shift even after it's already happened internally. Not because they're hiding it, because there's nothing to verbalize. From her perspective, nothing changed. The marriage is functioning as expected. He provides. She manages household decisions. Physical intimacy occurs when she feels like it. That's the structure. This is why men feel blindsided when they finally recognize the pattern. From his perspective, he's been steadily increasing investment and receiving steadily decreasing return. From her perspective, he's doing what husbands do and she's doing what wives do, and there's no problem to address. And here's where the real confusion happens. Men think, if I had set boundaries earlier, this wouldn't have happened. Maybe, but probably not, because the dynamic was established the moment she realized his provision was unconditional. Once that realization occurs, boundaries don't restore leverage, they just create conflict. Men are often told, you need to create desire. That's not possible inside a marriage where desire was never structurally necessary. Desire isn't created through provision. It exists independent of provision, or it doesn't exist. What men think of as creating desire is just them hoping that enough investment will eventually be rewarded. It won't. This is why the advice men get fails. Be more assertive. Withdraw attention. Refuse certain requests. None of that addresses the actual issue. If desire existed, none of that would be necessary. If it doesn't exist, none of that will generate it. You can't negotiate your way into being physically wanted by someone who has already decided you're functionally optional in that area. What happens instead is a kind of performance loop. The man adjusts his behavior, watches for results, tries being firmer, tries being more accommodating, tries being less available, and throughout all of this, he's operating inside a framework that assumes desire is responsive to his actions. It isn't. Desire either exists or it was never part of what she signed up for. The men who have functional physical intimacy in marriage aren't doing something smarter. They're in marriages where that element was present from the beginning and remained present. Their experience isn't replicable through strategy because it wasn't strategy dependent. It was selection dependent. But this reality gets obscured because no one wants to admit that some marriages were structured wrong from the start. Now here's the part men find difficult. Once she's settled into a marriage structure where physical intimacy is optional and his provision is mandatory, that structure doesn't restructure. Men think, maybe if I stop doing so much, she'll realize what she's losing. That's not how settled dynamics work. The structure has already formed. Changing your behavior within it doesn't change the structure. It just creates instability within a framework that won't fundamentally shift. This is often when men start looking for external explanations. Maybe she has low drive. Maybe she's dealing with something medical. Maybe therapy would help. Sometimes those things are factors, but more often, the explanation is simpler. The marriage was never structured with mutual physical attraction as a foundational element, and once that's absent, no amount of adjustment creates it later. Men don't want to hear this because it means they chose wrong. But recognizing this prevents decades of trying to fix something that was never structured to function the way they expected. Some marriages don't include mutual desire, not because someone failed, because it was never part of the agreement in the first place. What men often do instead, they stay, they provide, they hope things will shift, but the shift isn't coming. The structure is set, and structures, once established, don't reverse because of patience or increased investment. They just become more rigid. There's also this. Men conflate years invested with equity earned. They think, I've provided for a decade. I've been patient. I've been understanding. That should count for something. It does count, on paper. But her physical response doesn't operate on an equity model. She's not calculating years of provision. She's experiencing whether she feels drawn to him. And if she doesn't, no amount of prior provision changes that present moment reality. This is why divorce feels impossible to men. They're not just walking away from a person, they're walking away from years of investment. But that investment already failed to produce what it was supposed to produce. Continuing it won't change the return, it just extends the loss. And here's what makes this particularly difficult: children. Most men who recognize this dynamic don't leave because they can't accept the idea of another man in their children's home. So they stay. They continue providing. They accept a marriage that functions as financial arrangement rather than mutual partnership, because the alternative feels worse. From here, the marriage continues in a form where he's permanently providing at full capacity while receiving minimal reciprocity. She's not withholding deliberately. She's just settled into a structure where his effort is expected and her minimal participation is accepted. And that structure doesn't shift. This isn't about blame. It's about recognizing when provision is compensating for something that should exist without compensation. When a man finds himself negotiating for basic physical intimacy in his own marriage, the question isn't how to negotiate better. It's whether the marriage was ever structured with that element as foundational in the first place. Most of the time, it wasn't. And no amount of provision changes that.